The metal pan crashed to the floor with a sound like an explosion, and in that moment, Jake Morrison was no longer in the MasterChef kitchen. He was back in Kandahar, dust filling his lungs, the screams of his squad echoing in his ears, and the metallic taste of blood and fear flooding his mouth. When the flashback hit, it hit like a freight train, and the 28-year-old war veteran collapsed to his knees in front of 15 cameras and a studio audience that had no idea they were about to witness something that would haunt them forever. The cameras kept rolling, but this was no longer about cooking. This was about a soldier who had traded one battlefield for another and discovered that some wars never really end, they just find new places to fight you. It had started as the most intense pressure test in MasterChef history. The kitchen blazed under harsh studio lights, every surface gleaming steel and chrome, every sound amplified by the cavernous space. Gordon Ramsay stood at the front like a culinary commander, his white chef's coat pristine, his energy crackling with the kind of intensity that made great television. "Tonight," Gordon announced, his voice cutting through the kitchen's electric tension, "you're cooking for your life. This is an elimination challenge that will send two of you home. You have 90 minutes to create a dish worthy of a Michelin-starred restaurant." 12 contestants stood behind their stations, the pressure so thick you could taste it. This deep into the competition, everyone was a legitimate threat. Every mistake was potentially fatal. Every technique had to be flawless. Jake Morrison stood at Station 4, his broad shoulders tense under his chef's whites, his hands that had once gripped a rifle in the mountains of Afghanistan, now gripping the edge of his steel workstation. At 28, he was older than most contestants, and it showed in his eyes. There was a gravity there, a weight that came from seeing things that couldn't be unseen. What his fellow contestants didn't know, what the producers didn't know, what even the psychological evaluators hadn't fully grasped during casting, was that Jake had been fighting two wars simultaneously for the past 3 years. The war in Afghanistan had ended for him when an IED took out his Humvee and half his squad. But the war in his mind, that one raged on every single day. Cooking had become his therapy, his anchor, his way of creating something beautiful in a world that had shown him too much ugliness. The kitchen was the one place where the hypervigilance that made him jump at car backfires actually served a purpose, where his obsessive attention to detail, a survival mechanism that had kept him alive in a war zone, translated into perfect knife work and flawless timing. But tonight was different. Tonight, the kitchen felt less like sanctuary and more like another battlefield. "Your time starts now." The kitchen exploded into controlled chaos. Our contestants sprinted to the pantry, their minds racing through techniques and flavor profiles. The sound was overwhelming, pans clattering, ovens slamming, knives hitting cutting boards in rapid-fire succession. The industrial ventilation system hummed overhead like helicopter blades. Jake grabbed his ingredients with military precision: lamb rack, root vegetables, fresh herbs. He'd planned this dish for weeks. Herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables and red wine reduction. Classic technique, flawless execution, something that would showcase everything he'd learned in the competition. But as he returned to his station and began to work, the sounds of the kitchen started to blur together in a way that made his chest tighten. The rapid chopping of knives began to sound like automatic gunfire. The hiss of pans hitting hot oil echoed like incoming mortar rounds. The shouting between contestants, "Behind you! Hot pan! Coming through!" started to sound like the chaos of combat. Jake tried to focus on his lamb, on the familiar rhythm of French trimming the rack, but his hands were beginning to shake just slightly in a way that made his knife work less precise than usual. 45 minutes remaining!" Gordon's voice boomed across the kitchen. Around him, the other contestants were in full flow. Amanda was confidently building her soufflé, calling out instructions to herself like a seasoned chef. David was breaking down a whole fish with surgeon-like precision. The energy was competitive, intense, but excited. Jake's energy was different. With each passing minute, each clattering pan, each shouted direction, he felt himself slipping further away from the present moment and deeper into memories that lived just below the surface of his consciousness. He started his red wine reduction, the liquid bubbling and steaming in the pan, but when the alcohol hit the hot surface and flared up, a normal cooking technique he'd done hundreds of times, the sudden burst of flame triggered something primal in his nervous system. For just a moment, he was back in that Humvee, watching the world explode around him. Jake stumbled backward from his station, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He tried to ground himself using the techniques his VA therapist had taught him. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch. But the kitchen was too loud, too chaotic, too overwhelming. The other contestants were too focused on their own dishes to notice his distress. Gordon was across the kitchen, critiquing someone's sauce technique. The cameras captured his struggle, but from a distance it looked like normal pressure test stress. Only it wasn't normal stress. This was a full-blown panic attack triggered by combat PTSD in the middle of a televised cooking competition. Jake tried to return to his station, tried to push through it like he'd been trained to do. Soldiers don't break down, soldiers adapt and overcome, but his hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his knife safely. 20 minutes remaining. The announcement hit Jake like a physical blow. 20 minutes. He needed to plate in 20 minutes, and he could barely breathe, much less cook. His lamb was overcooked, his vegetables were burning, and his reduction had boiled down to nothing while he fought demons that existed only in his mind. That's when disaster struck. Jake reached for his sauté pan, but his hands were trembling so violently that he couldn't get a proper grip. The pan slipped from his fingers and crashed to the kitchen floor with a metallic clang that reverberated through the entire space. For everyone else in the kitchen, it was just a dropped pan, annoying but part of the chaos. For Jake, it was the sound of an incoming RPG. The flashback hit him like a physical force, dropping him to his knees beside his workstation. Suddenly, he wasn't a 28-year-old contestant on a cooking show. He was a 24-year-old soldier watching his best friend die in a roadside bombing, feeling helpless, feeling guilty for surviving when better men didn't make it home. The sounds of the kitchen, which moments before had been merely overwhelming, now transformed into the soundtrack of his worst memories. Every clatter was gunfire. Every shout was a cry for help. Every hiss of steam was the sound of something burning that shouldn't be burning. Jake pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the noise, but you can't block out sounds that exist only in your memory. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest tight with panic. He was having what VA doctors called a severe dissociative episode, but in the moment, it just felt like dying. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't. They're all dead. I couldn't save them." The first person to notice was Sarah, the contestant at the station next to him. She looked over to ask if he was okay and saw Jake on his knees, rocking slightly, his face pale and covered in sweat, his eyes staring at something only he could see. "Jake," she said tentatively, "are you all right?" But Jake couldn't hear her. He was trapped in Kandahar, Afghanistan, watching his squad leader bleed out in the sand while he helplessly applied pressure to wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. Sarah immediately called out, "Gordon, something's wrong with Jake." The kitchen didn't stop. Most contestants were too deep in their own culinary battles to process what was happening, but Gordon's head snapped up immediately, his experienced eye taking in the scene at Station 4. What he saw there made him forget about television, about competition, about everything except the fact that a young man was clearly in crisis. Gordon dropped what he was doing and moved quickly across the kitchen, his chef's intuition telling him this wasn't about cooking anymore. As he got closer, he could see Jake's hands shaking, could hear him muttering words that sounded like military call signs and coordinates. "Jake," Gordon said gently, kneeling down beside him. "Jake, look at me." But Jake couldn't look at him. He was staring at the kitchen floor, but seeing desert sand. He was hearing the sounds of battle that existed only in his traumatized memory. "They didn't make it home," Jake whispered, tears starting to stream down his face. "Rodriguez, Martinez, Thompson. I was supposed to watch their backs. I was supposed to bring them home." That's when Gordon understood. This wasn't a cooking breakdown. This was a combat veteran having a PTSD episode in the middle of a televised kitchen. Behind the scenes, Gordon made a decision that defied every rule of reality television. "Stop everything," Gordon called out, his voice carrying absolute authority across the kitchen. "Everyone stop cooking, now." 11 contestants looked up in confusion, their hands frozen over their dishes. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets. "You don't stop a pressure test, you don't halt production," but Gordon wasn't asking for permission. "Everyone step away from your stations," Gordon commanded, "right now." The kitchen fell silent except for the humming of equipment and Jake's labored breathing. 11 contestants stood motionless, watching their competition leader kneel beside a fellow competitor who was clearly in the grip of something much more serious than culinary pressure. Gordon turned to the production team. "Cut the cameras. This young man needs help, not an audience." "Gordon, we're in the middle of—" a producer started. "I said cut the cameras," Gordon repeated, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "This is not entertainment. This is a human being in crisis." For 3 minutes, the MasterChef kitchen existed outside of television. No cameras, no production, no show. Just Gordon Ramsay, a war veteran having a breakdown, and 11 contestants who were beginning to understand they were witnessing something that transcended competition. When the cameras resumed, something fundamental had changed in the kitchen's atmosphere. Gordon was still kneeling beside Jake, but now his approach was different. Not the television personality, not the chef mentor, but Gordon the father, the human being who understood that some battles can't be won with technique or determination. "Jake," Gordon said softly, "I need you to listen to my voice. You're not in Afghanistan. You're in Los Angeles. You're in the MasterChef kitchen. You're safe." Gordon had dealt with traumatized people before, not just in restaurants, but through his work with veterans' charities. He knew that you couldn't rush someone out of a flashback. You had to guide them back to the present, gently, patiently. "Can you tell me 3 things you can see?" Gordon asked, using a grounding technique he'd learned from military psychologists. Jake's breathing was still rapid, but he managed to look around the kitchen. "Stainless steel," he whispered. "Bright lights, the MasterChef logo." "Good. That's very good. Now 2 things you can hear." Jake listened for a moment. "Your voice. The ventilation system. Perfect. And 1 thing you can feel." Jake placed his hand on the cold kitchen floor. Cold, smooth, real. Slowly, carefully, Gordon helped guide Jake back to the present moment. It took nearly 10 minutes, 10 minutes that would normally be crucial in a timed cooking challenge, but that everyone in that kitchen understood were the most important 10 minutes of the entire competition. As Jake's breathing normalized and his eyes began to focus on his actual surroundings rather than his traumatic memories, he became aware of where he was and what had happened. The embarrassment and shame hit him like a second wave of trauma. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking around at the 11 faces staring at him with expressions of concern and compassion. "I'm so sorry I ruined everything." That's when Gordon did something that had never happened in MasterChef history. He reached out and pulled Jake into a hug. Not a quick, camera-friendly embrace, but a real hug, the kind a father gives a son who's hurting, the kind that says you're not alone without needing words. "You didn't ruin anything," Gordon said firmly. "You survived a war. You served your country. You've been fighting battles that most of us can't even imagine. That's not something to apologize for." Around them, the other contestants were openly emotional. Sarah was crying. David had his hand over his mouth in shock. Amanda was holding on to the edge of her station for support. This wasn't the competitive dynamic they'd started with. This was 11 people witnessing the aftermath of trauma and understanding that some things were more important than culinary competition. Gordon helped Jake to his feet and addressed the entire kitchen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying both authority and compassion, What happened here tonight is something that happens to thousands of veterans every day. Jake served in Afghanistan. He gave years of his life to protect our freedom, and the wounds he carries aren't visible, but they're just as real as any physical injury. He turned to look at each contestant individually. This competition is about finding the best home cook in America. But being the best cook isn't just about technique or creativity. It's about character. It's about how you handle pressure, how you support each other, how you respond when someone needs help. Gordon walked back to Jake, who was now standing, but still visibly shaken. Jake, I want you to know something. What happened tonight doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And the fact that you've been able to compete at this level while carrying those memories, that's the strongest thing I've ever seen in this kitchen. Jake's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears, not the tears of panic and flashback, but tears of recognition and relief. I wanted to honor them, Jake said quietly. My squad. I wanted to show that their sacrifice meant something, that I could build something beautiful with the life they helped save. And you have, Gordon replied firmly. Every dish you've cooked in this competition, every technique you've mastered, every moment you've pushed through when it would have been easier to quit, that's honoring them. Gordon turned to the other contestants. We're going to restart this challenge. Everyone gets a fresh 90 minutes. But first, I want each of you to understand something about the man standing beside me. What followed was unprecedented in reality television. Gordon asked Jake if he was comfortable sharing his story, and when Jake nodded, Gordon guided him through explaining what he'd experienced, not for drama, not for television, but for education and understanding. Jake talked about his service, about losing friends in an IED explosion, about the hypervigilance and flashbacks that had made civilian life a daily struggle. He talked about how cooking had become his therapy, how the precision and creativity required in the kitchen helped quiet the chaos in his mind. The kitchen is the only place where all the intensity in my head actually serves a purpose, Jake explained, where paying attention to every detail, being ready for anything to go wrong, actually helps instead of hurts. By the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the kitchen. The other contestants weren't looking at him with pity, but with awe and respect. They understood now that they'd been competing alongside someone who had fought battles that made a pressure test look like child's play. When the challenge restarted, something beautiful happened. The competitive atmosphere didn't disappear, but it was tempered by something deeper, genuine care for each other as human beings. When Jake struggled with his timing, Sarah quietly helped him organize his station. When he needed encouragement, David offered words of support. When his hands started shaking again from residual adrenaline, Amanda calmly talked him through breathing exercises. Jake's lamb, when he finally plated it 90 minutes later, wasn't perfect. The vegetables were slightly overcooked. The sauce was a bit thin, but when Gordon tasted it, he closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. Jake, Gordon said, this dish tastes like courage. It tastes like determination. It tastes like someone who refuses to let his past define his future. Jake wasn't eliminated that night. In fact, Gordon announced that the episode would end differently than planned, with a discussion about veteran mental health, resources for PTSD support, and a reminder that strength comes in many forms. The episode, when it aired 6 months later, became more than television. It became a catalyst for conversations about mental health, military service, and the invisible wounds that so many veterans carry. The show partnered with veterans organizations to provide resources and support. Jake went on to finish 4th in the competition, but more importantly, he became an advocate for veteran mental health awareness. He opened a small restaurant called Charlie Company in his hometown, named after his military unit, where he hires and trains veterans who are transitioning to civilian life. The metal pan that clattered to the floor that night was retired from the MasterChef kitchen, but the conversation it started, the awareness it raised, and the understanding it created continue to impact lives long after the cameras stopped rolling, because that's what Gordon Ramsay learned that night, that sometimes the most important lessons in a kitchen have nothing to do with cooking. Sometimes they're about recognizing when someone is fighting battles you can't see and choosing compassion over competition, understanding over judgment, and human connection over television drama. Jake's journey proved that the strongest people aren't those who never break. They're the ones who break, get help, and find the courage to keep building something beautiful with the pieces.